Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to Contemplating Catholicism. When I was a Protestant pastor, I did some premarital counseling. And one of the areas that we would address concerned the whole area of procreation, having children. And inevitably, we'd talk about the purpose of sex in a marriage, and also we would talk about contraception. There's a couple books that I used to recommend. One was by Ed Wheat, and it's been updated since that time, since the time I used to recommend it. He and his wife have both chipped in on this book. It's called Intended for Pleasure. And that tells you in the Protestant world, many in the Protestant world, what they believe is that sex is primarily intended for pleasure. There's another book, it's called Pure Pleasure, written by Gary Thomas. And the subtitle is, Why Do Christians Feel So Bad About Feeling Good? Again, it's intended for pleasure. Another book I used to recommend was The Act of Marriage. It's been out for quite some time now. Tim and Beverly LaHaye. And they have another one out I just noticed too. It's called The Act of Marriage After 40. I wonder if they're going to have one after 70, because I don't know if people keep growing, keep getting older. But in many of these views that these popular Christian authors give, contraception is taken for granted, that it's something that you'll do as married couples, and ultimately it's up to you to decide what kind of or what method you're going to use. Well, in the Catholic world, contraception is viewed as an evil act, as a sinful act. And the reason for that, if you go back to the etymology of the word contraception, what does that mean? Contra means against. Contraception, it comes from that word conception. It means against conception. And basically what you're doing with contraceptives is you're using some kind of artificial means to stop conception, whether it's the birth control pill, or whether it's an IUD, or whether it's some kind of sterilization. You're wanting to stop conception. And the thing I'd like to consider with you is there's an alternative, and Catholics, we believe there's an alternative. It's called natural family planning, or NFP, natural family planning. And basically what it is knowing when the time of the ovulation of the woman will occur, and then planning around that. The Catholic Church isn't against family planning. We need to be wise when it comes to that area. But it has clearly taught, and it clearly teaches today, that contraception against conception, using an artificial means to curtail conception, is inherently evil. Now, why do we hold to that? Why is that the case? I think it comes down to what we believe is the primary purpose of sex. The primary purpose of sex according to Scripture and also Catholic teaching, is not pleasure, but it's procreation. It's to bring children into the world. Of course, God made that process pleasurable for most people. We wouldn't have as many people in the world if he hadn't made it that way. But to curtail conception artificially, that's what we're talking about here. And again, it goes back to Genesis, where God, he says that to male and female, we're to be fruitful and multiply. And we see this reflected in Psalm 127, where it speaks of the fact that children are a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. And it says that blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Many don't believe that anymore. And it's interesting to see how people interpret that verse now in different contexts. But the fact is, conception against, the root of it means against conception, contraception. There's a right way to do family planning, and contraception is not one of them. We were, in our childbirthing years, we were in the Protestant arena, and we used different things. But we always believe that children are indeed a gift of God, and we had 4 children, and as we count them now, as they've gotten married, and we're about to have, the Lord willing, 20 in our family. They multiplied. But I do believe in this whole area of natural family planning and curtailing contraception. And the more I looked into the history of it, the more convinced that I became of the inherent evil in contraception. Now, and I'll explain it here. First of all, we have to understand that sex is not primarily a recreational activity, something for my pleasure, whether inside of marriage or outside of marriage. Sexual activity is for procreation. But this philosophical understanding that somehow it has to have full expression no matter what, no matter when a woman's in her menstrual cycle or whatever, you need to be able to express it. Where does that come from? Where does that kind of thinking come from? The Catholic Church has been under tremendous pressure to change their position on contraception. And many Catholics don't practice what the Catholic Church teaches concerning contraception. Even though natural family planning can be very effective and it can be useful for planning a family, many want to use contraception. But why is the church so against contraception? In the 1960s, there was a 72-member advisory committee that was going to advise the Vatican concerning this area of conception. Again, a great swell of wanting the Vatican to change their position when it comes to this whole area. And the result of this was Pope Paul VI writing what's known as Humanae Vitae. And Humanae Vitae, he basically said the church is holding to its traditional view concerning contraception. It's inherently evil. And he also gave a warning that there are 4 things that will result if we buy into this whole idea of contraception, against conception. First of all, he said, it will lead to a general lowering of moral standards. since the 1960s. We can certainly see that it's led to a general lowering of moral standards ever since contraception was so easily gotten by many different people, whether you were married or single. It's lowered moral standards. It will lead to an increase in marital infidelity, illegitimacy, and divorce with all their associated problems, was the second thing that was stated in this document. Indeed, that's been the case. There's been an increase in infidelity. There's been an increase in illegitimacy of having children outside of wedlock. There's been an increase in divorce and all the problems that come with it. Prophetic. The third thing was men will not treat women with dignity they deserve, but rather objectify them and use them. And that's certainly been the case. Instead of viewing sex as something sacred, the womb as something sacred, women became more objectified. And many women bought into that too and have welcomed it more on the other end. The fourth thing was governments will use contraception as a tool for authoritative control over a population. That's certainly true. Our government's been doing that. The Bill Gates Foundation does that. Many who give to the poor in other countries, including Africa, they attach contraception to aid, trying to control their population. And they use that as a tool to control other nations. An author by the name of Don Johnson wrote a book entitled Twisted to Destruction. It's a book about how many times Protestants can take scripture and try to twist it in such a way to legitimize certain things. And he uses the example of contraception. Another was an example of how people perceive slavery and immigration and all those things. But contraception was one of the big areas. And basically, he goes into some history concerning how contraception was perceived once Protestants began to buy into the concept and what was said about the Catholic Church as a result. And one was that the Catholic Church is being like the USSR at that time, the Soviet Union. They're trying to control people. Another thing was Christianity Today said that Catholics need to come to biblical truth, the biblical truth concerning contraception. And what do you mean by that? Biblical truth. Where do you find that in Scripture? I've never seen a Scripture verse say something specific about the legitimacy of contraception. To be against conception, in fact, what we find is just the opposite. Contraception or conception is something to be welcomed. And to thwart it in many ways is to bring disrepute on the plan of God. Monsignor George Kelly and John Paul II wrote a book entitled Keeping the Church Catholic. I have it in my library here. And they make this point. Anti-abortion arguments are not successful with peoples whose moral system already accepts contraception. And with their assumed moral right to turn this evil into a good, calling conception or contraception an evil. In fact, abortion, sterilization, and contraception are linked philosophically, morally, industrially, and politically. And indeed, many Catholics who have bought into contraception also accept abortion. They are linked together. They're together philosophically, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. How they're linked, not only philosophically, they're linked historically. How did it come to pass here in America, this whole idea of contraception? Well, if you want to look at the historical roots of it, and this was what convinced me too, when I go back to the historical roots of contraception here in America, I became more convinced that it's inherently evil. The historical roots go back to Sigmund Freud. In 1900, Sigmund Freud wrote a book entitled The Interpretation of Dreams. I don't know if it's talking about wet dreams or what kind of dreams here. But basically, what Sigmund Freud says in this particular book is that the sex drive is the most important aspect in human life. Now, I believe that when I was a teenager, I might have bought into that, but certainly not now. That sex drive, it's the most important drive. Therefore, the result of that, from his particular standpoint, you had someone that actually studied under him. It was William Reich, and William Reich was one that brought it here to America. He started a sex clinic here and did different studies. But the thinking was people need to give full expression to their sexual yearning. It's the most important thing in human life. Everyone needs to be able to release this energy. And if this energy is suppressed in any way, it's going to lead to a lot of mental illness. So, that philosophy helped contribute to some of the thinking of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, where people were buying into that. We need to give full expression. But there was just one problem with doing this, and that was unwanted pregnancies. Somehow we've got to get a handle on unwanted pregnancies. If you're going to fulfill this Freudian William Reich philosophy, we've got to curtail unwanted pregnancies. And who was it at that time that came into vogue? It was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, she wrote a book entitled The Pivot of Civilization. The Pivot of Civilization. And Margaret Sanger was a Darwinist. She believed in the survival of the fittest. And she also believed that somehow we needed to call out the element of our society that are not the most fit. So she, in her book, The Pivot of Civilization, she calls for a full-scale medical contraception in America. And many people bought into it. Particularly for those who were considered mentally ill in any way. In fact, they even defined that in such a way as if you are an imbecile. If you're an imbecile is someone who may have a moderate amount of intellectual disability. Even if you had a moderate amount, you were considered an imbecile. And what was being called for was to make these people sterile, so that they don't go on and procreate in any way. But Margaret Sanger had a time of fighting at this time, and basically what it was the church. The church didn't buy into that. And if you take that argument by itself now, the church wouldn't buy into it. But the church, particularly Protestant church, they began to buy into this thinking that we need to give full expression of sex within the confines of marriage, of course. But they bought into this whole idea of using contraceptives in marriage. Eventually, Margaret Sanger, she founded Planned Parenthood. They dispensed the pill. And of course, abortions were part of that same thinking. Philosophically, they're related. Abortion and yes, terminating a pregnancy is related to keeping a pregnancy from happening artificially to begin with. They both come from a concept that brings disrepute on procreation. So at this time, we're saying sex is good. You need to express it. And that same kind of thinking was, it continued in other areas between sex between two males, two females. And if society suppresses that in any way, it's dysphoria. It causes dysphoria in someone. But it's all related to the same kind of thinking. The roots of contraception is not pretty here in America. It philosophically, it's not scriptural. Philosophically, historically, it comes from roots that are anti Catholic, anti scripture, anti Protestant too, if you hold to the scripture. You end up twisting scripture to make something legitimate that God never said is legitimate. We live in a day where many people call Catholics, some as cafeteria Catholics, that we pick and choose what part of church teaching we want to hold to. But people do that to their own demise. People do that in a way that brings something into their lives that is very detrimental. And they miss out on the blessing that God has given. What's the primary purpose of sex in marriage? It's the sacredness of procreation, being able to have children, and what a blessing that is. If you lose sight of that and you say, well, the primary purpose is pleasure. Well, what happens then if your mate doesn't give you that pleasure anymore? For whatever reason. You're going to go look for it somewhere else if that's the primary pleasure, if it's primarily for pleasure. Our world believes that. And they may go from mate to mate to mate. But we can't do that. Primary purpose of marriage is not sexual pleasure. It's sacrificing ourselves for our mates, giving to them, loving them for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, no matter what. And it's raising children for the glory of God. That's what we're doing. Don't buy into it. What a precious gift God has given us. Thank you very much. You have a great day.